March 15, 1934, 9:23 a.m., New York Police Department Headquarters, Lower Manhattan. The morning light filtered through the tall windows of the precinct, casting long shadows across the polished wooden floors. Detective James McAllister had been working the Harlem beat for 13 years, long enough to know every cop on the take, every informant with a price, and every criminal organization that ran the neighborhoods under his jurisdiction. But on this particular morning, sitting in the austere office of Captain Michael Donovan, waiting for a meeting that would change everything, he felt the weight of something shifting, something fundamental. The door opened without a knock, and Arthur Flegenheimer walked in like he owned the building. He probably did own the building, or at least owned the people who owned it. Dutch Schultz, as everyone called him, wore a charcoal gray suit that cost more than most cops made in a year. His shoes were polished to a mirror shine. His tie was silk, a deep burgundy that matched the small pin on his lapel, a golden dollar sign, because subtlety had never been Dutch Schultz's style. He was 56 years old, but his face had the kind of hardness that came from decades of deciding who lived and who died, who prospered and who disappeared into the Hudson River with their pockets full of stones. Captain Donovan stood immediately, shaking Dutch's hand like a man greeting a foreign dignitary. "Please, sir, sit down. Can I get you anything? Coffee?" Dutch Schultz didn't sit. He remained standing, his dark eyes scanning the office with the precision of a man assessing his surroundings for threats, for exits, for opportunities. "No coffee. I'm here because we have a problem, Captain, and I need your help solving it." McAllister shifted in his chair, watching the interaction unfold. He knew Dutch Schultz by reputation. Of course, everyone in law enforcement knew Dutch Schultz. The man had single-handedly revolutionized the bootlegging business during Prohibition, taking what had been a chaotic street-level operation and turning it into something approaching a legitimate corporation. He had political connections that reached into City Hall. He had judges on his payroll. He had entire precincts of police working for him, not just individual cops, but whole departments, moving in unison to protect his interests and eliminate his competitors. Dutch Schultz had built an empire in New York, and that empire generated millions of dollars every year. "Detective McAllister," Dutch said, acknowledging him for the first time, "I've heard good things about you. I've heard you're a man who understands how the world works. A man who understands that sometimes, in order to maintain peace and stability, certain sacrifices have to be made. Certain problems have to be solved in ways that don't necessarily follow the official rulebook." McAllister felt his stomach tighten. He knew what was coming. He'd been in this position before. The position where a powerful man tells you what he wants and implicitly explains that your career, your family, maybe even your life, depends on whether you comply. "Yes, sir," McAllister replied carefully. "I do understand how things work." "Good, then you'll understand what I'm about to tell you." Dutch finally sat down, crossing his legs with the casual elegance of someone accustomed to commanding rooms. "There's a young colored boy operating in Harlem, calls himself Bumpy Johnson. Moving numbers, running protection rackets, making himself rich off my territory. My understanding is that he's been quite successful at it, quite profitable." McAllister nodded slowly. "Bumpy Johnson? Yes, sir. I'm aware of the operation." Dutch leaned forward, his hands folded in his lap. "What I need to understand is whether you're aware of something else. Whether you understand that no one operates in New York, in any neighborhood, without paying tribute to me. Whether you understand that my territory, all of it, from the Battery to the Bronx, belongs to me. And anyone who thinks otherwise is making a grave mistake." Captain Donovan stepped into the silence that followed. "I think what Mr. Schultz is trying to say is that we want to ensure there's no confusion about jurisdiction, about who controls what." Dutch raised his hand slightly, silencing the captain. "What I'm trying to say is much simpler. I want Bumpy Johnson arrested. I want him locked up in the Tombs, and I want it done within 3 days. By Friday, March 18th, he needs to be in a cell, charged with something serious enough that he stays there. Narcotics trafficking would be perfect. Racketeering even better. I don't particularly care which charge you use, detective. That's your expertise. I just care about the result." McAllister felt the full weight of what was being asked. This wasn't just about arresting a small-time criminal. This was about breaking an understanding that had existed in New York's underworld for decades. The 5 Italian families controlled their territories, the Irish mobs controlled theirs, the Jewish gangsters controlled Manhattan, and Harlem, the black neighborhoods, those had always been separate, autonomous. Outside the jurisdiction of the major crime families, it was an understanding that had kept New York from tearing itself apart. Detective Dutch continued, standing up and walking to the window, looking out over the city that he believed he owned. I don't think you understand the severity of what's happening. There's a young boy in Harlem who thinks he can ignore me, who thinks he can run operations, make money, build power, all without my permission, all without paying me. Do you understand what message that sends? What happens when other boys in other neighborhoods start thinking they can do the same thing? What happens when the Italians see that I've allowed my own territory to be carved up by someone I should be able to crush with a phone call? Captain Donovan interjected nervously. Mr. Schultz, surely there are ways to handle this that don't involve the police directly. Ways that are more, shall we say, discreet? Dutch turned from the window, and his expression was ice. I could have someone shoot him. I could have him beaten to death in an alley. I could have him thrown in the river. Those are the other options. But I thought it would be cleaner, more professional, if we did this through official channels. If we arrested him for crimes he's clearly committing. If we let the law do what the law should do. But, if you'd prefer, I can arrange for a more traditional solution. No, Dutch said quickly. I think the police approach is the right approach. Detective McAllister, you'll handle this personally. McAllister heard himself say yes before he'd fully processed what was happening. Yes, sir, I'll handle it. Excellent, Dutch said, and he smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the smile of a man who had just acquired a piece on a chessboard he could move around at will. Then we have an understanding. 3 days, Detective, by Friday, I'll expect to hear that Bumpy Johnson is in custody. Dutch walked to the door, paused, and turned back one final time. And Detective, if you do this right, if you handle this with the kind of professionalism I'm sure you're capable of, there will be $50,000 waiting for you. That's more money than you'll make in your entire career with the police force. More than enough to set up a comfortable life somewhere far away from New York if you ever decide you wanted to leave. After Dutch left, the office felt smaller somehow, colder. Captain Donovan loosened his tie. You understand what just happened, right? You understand what he's asking you to do? I understand, McAllister said quietly. He's asking me to break the agreement. The understanding that's kept this city from tearing itself apart? Exactly, the Italians aren't going to like this. Neither will the Irish. Neither will anyone else who's spent the last 20 years respecting boundaries. You move on Bumpy Johnson. You're starting something that you might not be able to control. McAllister sat in the silence of that office for a long moment. He thought about his family. He thought about his wife. He thought about his 2 daughters, one in high school, one in college. He thought about his mortgage. He thought about the debts he'd accumulated. He thought about what Dutch Schultz did to people who didn't comply with his wishes, and he realized that he didn't really have a choice at all. That same afternoon, at 12:47 p.m., in a small restaurant on 135th Street, called Marie's Kitchen, Bumpy Johnson was sitting at a table in the back, away from the windows, away from the street. He was a tall man for his age, 24 years old, with sharp features and eyes that seemed to see through people. He wore a well-tailored suit, not as expensive as Dutch Schultz's, but expensive enough to show that he was successful, that he was someone who had made money and knew how to keep it. Across from him sat 3 men, his closest advisors, the men he trusted completely. There was Yorkshire Pete, a scarred giant of a man, 6'3", 240 pounds, with a long scar running down the left side of his face from an old knife fight with a man from the Bronx who hadn't survived the encounter. Yorkshire Pete was the muscle, the enforcer, the man who could walk into a room and make people understand, through sheer presence, that they should cooperate or face consequences. There was Ellsworth West, younger than the others, only 22, but sharp-dressed and sharper-minded. Ellsworth had a gift for seeing angles, for understanding how information moved through Harlem, for connecting people who needed to be connected. He was the network, the web, the gossip that became intelligence. And there was Razor, a thin man with hands that moved constantly, always thinking, always calculating. Razor had earned his nickname not because he carried razors, but because his mind worked like one, cutting through complicated situations to their essence, finding the sharp truth at the center of confusion. A young man, maybe 19, came into the restaurant from the street. His name was Jerome, and he worked as a porter at the police precinct on 125th Street. He moved through the restaurant carefully, trying not to draw attention, and sat down at the table with the others. He ordered a coffee and a sandwich, but he didn't eat. Instead, he leaned forward and spoke quietly. Detective McAllister was seen leaving Dutch Schultz's car this morning, 2 blocks from the precinct. He looked scared, Jerome said. Really scared. Like he'd just been told something that frightened him. Bumpy's expression didn't change, but his eyes sharpened. Did you find out what the meeting was about? I've got a friend who works in the precinct office. He said McAllister went into Captain Donovan's office 20 minutes before Dutch showed up. There was yelling, loud voices, then they all went quiet, and when Dutch left, he was smiling. Yorkshire Pete stood up immediately. We need to leave. We need to get out of New York right now. This is too big for us. Bumpy. If Dutch Schultz is moving against you, we need to run. Bumpy held up his hand. Sit down, Pete. Sit down and listen. I'm going to tell you something, Bumpy said, and his voice was calm, measured, the voice of someone who had already thought through what was coming. I'm going to tell you something that most people in Harlem don't understand. Dutch Schultz has money. A lot of money. He has guns and he has police officers. He has judges and politicians. He has all the resources of a major criminal organization. But he doesn't have something that we have. He doesn't have community. He doesn't have neighborhood. He comes into Harlem like he owns it because he thinks money buys ownership. He thinks power buys respect. But it doesn't. Not here. Not in our neighborhood. Ellsworth West leaned forward. What are you going to do? Bumpy smiled slightly. The same thing I've been doing. I'm going to build something that Dutch Schultz can't understand and can't fight against. I'm going to make sure that every person in Harlem understands that I'm not just a numbers runner. I'm not just a criminal. I'm one of them. I'm their neighbor. I'm their protector. And when someone threatens me, they threaten all of us. Razor nodded slowly, understanding the strategy before Bumpy had fully articulated it. You're going to make it about Harlem, not about you? Exactly. Bumpy stood up. By tomorrow morning, I want every number runner, every informant, every person we have working for us to know that Dutch Schultz tried to have me arrested. I want them to tell everyone they know. I want this story to spread through Harlem like a fire. By the end of the week, everyone in this neighborhood needs to understand what's happening. Not as a gang war, as an invasion. As someone from outside trying to take what belongs to us, Yorkshire Pete was still skeptical. Bumpy Dutch Schultz has killed 50 men. Maybe more. You really think community is going to protect you against someone like that? Bumpy looked at him calmly. I think community is the only thing that's ever protected anyone against someone like that. Money can be taken, guns can be taken, but a neighborhood that stands together, that can't be taken, that can't be broken. That evening, Detective McAllister sat in his apartment, drinking whiskey that he hadn't paid for, that had been left on his doorstep with a note that said simply for your troubles, and was signed with a D. He kept thinking about what he'd agreed to do. He kept thinking about the fact that by Friday, he was supposed to have Bumpy Johnson in custody. He kept thinking about what happened to people who crossed Dutch Schultz and also crossed the unspoken agreements that governed New York's underworld. His wife, Margaret, was in the living room listening to the radio. She called in to him, James, dinner's ready. Are you coming? I'll be there in a moment. He called back, but he didn't move. He poured another drink instead and stared at his hands. These were the hands of a man who had taken an oath to uphold the law. These were also the hands of a man who was about to break every agreement that mattered, who was about to betray the informal treaties that kept New York from descending into chaos. By March 16th, the word had spread through Harlem like a fever. Dutch Schultz was moving against Bumpy Johnson. The police were going to arrest him. The white gangsters from downtown were trying to take over the neighborhood. But it wasn't just fear that spread. It was something else. It was a kind of determination. It was an understanding that this wasn't just about one man. This was about all of them. Bumpy Johnson spent that day and the next visiting every business in Harlem, every barbershop, every numbers operation, every grocery store, every restaurant, every jazz club. He didn't ask for help. He didn't need to. He simply let people know what was happening. And with each person he told, the story grew. It grew bigger and stronger and more important. It stopped being a story about one man's criminal operation and started being a story about whether Harlem belonged to the people of Harlem or to outsiders. By March 17th, the atmosphere in Harlem had changed completely. There was a tension in the air, an electricity, a sense that something significant was happening. Shops closed early, men gathered on corners in quiet groups, talking in low voices. Women passed information along the networks that connected households, that connected families, that connected the entire neighborhood into something like a nervous system, alert and sensitive to everything happening. Yorkshire Pete came to Bumpy on the evening of the 17th with a warning. I've been hearing rumors that McAllister is going to come early. Tomorrow morning, maybe, before the weekend, before you have time to organize anything. Bumpy nodded. Then we need to be ready by tomorrow morning. Let everyone in the neighborhood know. Tomorrow, if the police try to arrest me, I want people on the street, not with guns, not with violence, just people, presence, witnesses. Make sure that if they try to take me, the whole neighborhood sees it. March 18th arrived, gray and cold. Detective McAllister had barely slept. He'd spent the night thinking about what he was about to do. He'd thought about calling in sick. He'd thought about leaving town. He'd even thought about going to Bumpy Johnson and warning him, but he knew that none of those options would work. Dutch Schultz had seen to that. Dutch Schultz had made sure that McAllister was completely trapped. At 8:30 a.m., he gathered 3 uniformed officers and drove to Bumpy Johnson's apartment on 142nd Street. He had warrants. He had evidence, planted evidence, but good enough to hold up in court. He had the authority to arrest and detain. He had everything he needed, except the one thing that mattered. He didn't have the ability to arrest Bumpy Johnson without the entire neighborhood knowing about it. When they arrived at the apartment building, McAllister saw them. At first, it was just a few people, a few men, standing on the corner, watching. A few women, sitting on the stoops of nearby buildings. By the time McAllister and his officers had climbed the stairs to Bumpy's apartment, there were more, many more. By the time they knocked on the door, there were hundreds. Bumpy opened the door calmly, as if he'd been expecting them. He was dressed impeccably, his suit perfectly tailored, his shoes shined, his manner courteous and respectful. Yes, detective, can I help you? Bumpy Johnson, I have a warrant for your arrest on suspicion of narcotics trafficking and racketeering. I need you to come with me. Of course, detective, I'll come peacefully. Just let me get my coat. McAllister followed him inside, and Bumpy slowly put on his overcoat. They walked down the stairs together, the officers escorting him, and with each step, the crowd outside grew larger. Not threatening, not violent, just standing there, watching, bearing witness. When they reached the street, McAllister stopped. There were at least 500 people there, maybe more. Men, women, children, all of them watching as the police tried to arrest Bumpy Johnson, all of them seeing what was happening. All of them making mental note that this was an outside force, trying to remove someone from the community. McAllister looked at his 3 officers. He looked at Bumpy Johnson. He looked at the crowd. And in that moment, he understood something that neither he nor Dutch Schultz had fully appreciated. You could arrest one man, you could take him downtown and lock him up, but you couldn't arrest an entire neighborhood. You couldn't arrest the solidarity that had formed around him. You couldn't arrest the community's decision to stand together. McAllister's hands were shaking as he made the decision. He turned to the officers. Let's go. We're leaving, sir. One of the officers looked confused. We have the warrant. We have the evidence. I said, we're leaving now. What are you going to tell Dutch Schultz? McAllister didn't answer. He didn't know what to tell Dutch Schultz. He just knew that he couldn't be the instrument through which Dutch Schultz violated the most fundamental agreement of New York's underworld. He couldn't be the person who broke the peace. That evening, McAllister called the number that Dutch had given him. His hands were trembling as he dialed. Dutch picked up on the second ring. Yes, he's gone. McAllister lied. Bumpy Johnson left New York this morning. Our sources say he's heading to Philadelphia or maybe Boston. He's disappeared. There was a long silence on the other end. You're sure about this? Yes, sir. Positive. He understood the situation and got out. Good, Dutch said, and McAllister could hear something in his voice, something that wasn't quite satisfaction, more like resignation. Okay, detective, you did good work. Your $50,000 is waiting for you. Go spend it and forget about New York for a while. Take a vacation. You've earned it. After he hung up, McAllister sat in the darkness of his apartment and wondered what he'd just done. He'd lied to one of the most powerful criminals in New York. He'd sided with a young colored man from Harlem over the kingpin of the Eastern Seaboard. He'd done something that could get him killed. But what McAllister didn't understand was that Dutch Schultz was already beginning to understand that he'd made a mistake. A terrible, irreversible mistake. By March 19th, the story had spread beyond Harlem. It had reached the ears of the Italian families who ran Brooklyn and Queens. It had reached the ears of the Irish mobs who controlled Hell's Kitchen. It had reached the ears of every criminal organization in New York who had signed on to the unspoken agreement about territorial boundaries. What Dutch Schultz didn't realize was that he wasn't just attacking Bumpy Johnson, he was attacking the system itself. He was saying that an outsider could come into any neighborhood and take what he wanted. He was saying that the agreements that had kept the underworld stable didn't matter. He was threatening everyone. Frank Costello, the most powerful Italian boss in New York, called a meeting. Representatives from the 5 families came. They listened to the story of what had happened in Harlem. They listened to how a young colored man had united his entire community in the span of 3 days. They listened to how Bumpy Johnson had done something that no one had thought possible. He'd stopped Dutch Schultz without firing a shot. He'd organized resistance without forming an army. "We need to send a message," Costello said quietly. "We need to make clear that what Dutch Schultz did was unacceptable. He violated the agreement. He crossed the line. And if we don't respond, if we don't make it clear that there are consequences for violating the territorial agreements, then the whole system falls apart." By March 20th, Dutch Schultz's organization in New York was beginning to fracture. His drug dealers were being threatened by community members in Harlem. His numbers runners were being turned away from every block where Bumpy Johnson's influence extended. His enforcers, when they tried to move against Bumpy's operations, found themselves facing crowds of neighborhood residents, not with guns, but with unified resistance. Dutch called an emergency meeting with his closest lieutenants. "The situation has become untenable," he said. "The colored boy has done something unexpected. He's united the neighborhood against us. And worse, the families are starting to distance themselves from us. Costello won't take my calls." Gambino made it clear that Harlem is now off-limits. "It seems I've made a strategic error." One of his men, a soldier named Vincent, spoke up. "We could still take him out. We could put a bullet in the back of his head, make it look like a robbery gone wrong." Dutch Schultz shook his head. "No, if I kill him now, it looks like I'm confirming what the neighborhood already believes. It looks like I'm acknowledging that I can't beat him legitimately. It looks like I'm admitting defeat and resorting to assassination because I have no other options. That's not the message I want to send. That's not how I want this to end." "Then what do we do?" Vincent asked. "We retreat," Dutch said quietly. "We pull out of Harlem. We concede the territory. And we make it clear that we're doing this not because Bumpy Johnson beat us, but because the greater criminal community has decided that Harlem is off. We save face by pretending this was about respect for boundaries, not about our failure to break a single young man and his neighborhood." But before Dutch Schultz pulled out completely, he did something that surprised everyone who heard about it. He sent a message to Bumpy Johnson. It came through intermediaries, through people who worked the boundaries between the Italian families and the independent operators. The message was brief. It said simply, "You win, respect. Don't come after me, and I won't come after you. Harlem is yours." Bumpy Johnson received the message on March 21st, 4 days after Dutch Schultz had first ordered his arrest. He was sitting in the same restaurant where he'd planned his response with Yorkshire Pete, Ellsworth West, and Razor. When the messenger told him what Dutch had said, Bumpy smiled slightly. "He understands now," Bumpy said. "He finally understands that you can't take a neighborhood if the neighborhood doesn't want to be taken. You can't move against a man if his community stands with him." By March 25th, Dutch Schultz had retreated to upstate New York, to the small towns around Albany, where he still had some influence and some power, but nothing like what he'd controlled in New York City. His empire in the city had begun to collapse. His operations were being taken over by the Italian families. His money was slowly draining away as his organization fragmented. Within a year, Dutch Schultz would be essentially powerless, a former kingpin reduced to running small-time operations in the provinces. But that wasn't the end of the story. That was just the beginning of something much larger. On March 22nd, Bumpy Johnson called a meeting in a church on 135th Street. Not a secret meeting. Not a meeting in a speakeasy or a back room. A meeting in a church, in the light of day, visible to anyone who wanted to see it. He stood in front of his community. This man who had been running numbers for 5 years, who had been generous with his money, who had helped families who couldn't pay their rent, who had protected businesses from harassment, and he told them something that would define his life and his leadership. "I want to thank you," he said simply. "I want to thank you for standing with me. I want to thank you for understanding that when someone threatens one of us, they threaten all of us." What happened this week? What happened between us and Dutch Schultz? It wasn't a criminal matter. It was something bigger. It was about whether Harlem belongs to us or whether it belongs to people downtown with money and guns. He paused, looking out at the faces of his community. Harlem belongs to us, not because I say so, not because I have the most power or the most money, but because we say so, because we stand together, because we refuse to be ruled by people who don't live here, who don't understand us, who don't respect us. The response from the neighborhood was overwhelming. People stood and applauded. People cheered. People understood that something fundamental had shifted in how power worked in their neighborhood. A young man from Harlem had stood up to one of the most powerful criminals in America and won, not through violence, not through cruelty, but through community, through loyalty, through being willing to stand and say, "No, you can't have this." In the weeks that followed, Bumpy Johnson's organization grew exponentially. Young men from all over Harlem wanted to work for him, not because they expected to get rich, although some would, but because they understood that he was loyal to his people. They understood that he wouldn't abandon them or sacrifice them for his own gain. They understood that Bumpy Johnson was different from the other gangsters they'd encountered. Word of what had happened in March spread through New York's underworld with incredible speed. Every criminal from Boston to Baltimore heard the story. They heard about how a young colored man had united his entire community and forced how it bout one of the most powerful gangsters in America. They heard about how Bumpy Johnson had done something that no one thought was possible. They heard about a man who understood that real power came not from guns or money, but from community. The Italian families made a decision in the weeks that followed. Harlem was off limits. It belonged to Bumpy Johnson. Any attempt to move into Harlem would be considered a violation of the territorial agreements. This was the first time in the history of New York's underworld that the major crime families had agreed to respect the autonomy of a black neighborhood and its leadership. It was a precedent, and precedents matter. The Irish mobs made the same decision. The Jewish gangsters who still operated in the city made the same decision. Within a month of the events of March 1934, it had become the law of New York's underworld. Bumpy Johnson controlled Harlem. Anyone who disagreed could deal with the consequences. Dutch Schultz tried twice more to expand his operations back into New York City over the next year. Both times he was met with resistance from the Italian families. Both times he was forced to back down. His power continued to erode. His allies continued to abandon him. By October of 1935, Dutch Schultz had become a liability. He had become someone who was better off dead than alive, from the perspective of the major crime families. On October 23, 1935, just 18 months after he'd tried to move against Bumpy Johnson, Dutch Schultz was shot and killed in a restaurant in Newark, New Jersey. His bodyguards were also killed. His empire, the largest criminal organization the American underworld had ever seen, collapsed within days of his death. Some say it was the Italian families who ordered the hit. Some say it was the Irish. Some say it was people Dutch had double-crossed along the way. But everyone understood the truth. Dutch Schultz had sealed his own fate when he decided to cross the line. When he decided that money was enough to break the agreements that mattered. When he decided that he could move against Bumpy Johnson and Harlem and suffer no consequences, he was wrong, and his death was the price he paid for that mistake. Bumpy Johnson lived another 34 years after that week in March, when the city had seemed to shake with the force of community resistance. He became a legend. He became the undisputed king of Harlem, not because he was the richest or the most violent, but because he was the most loyal to his people. He built an empire based on the principle that a neighborhood that stands together is more powerful than any external force trying to break it down. Years later, when other young men from Harlem would come to him, seeking advice on how to build their own power, Bumpy would tell them the same thing over and over again. The most powerful thing in the world is a community that stands together. Money is temporary. Power is temporary. Guns can be taken away. But a neighborhood that believes in you, that trusts you, that will stand with you when everything is falling apart, that's something that lasts. That's something that can't be taken away. That's the real power. That's what matters. The story of March 1934, when Harlem exploded in 6 days, became part of the fabric of New York's underworld history. It became a story fathers told their sons. It became a story that explained how power really worked in America, not through money alone, not through violence alone, but through community, through loyalty, through a man willing to stand and say, "No, you can't have this. This is ours. We will defend it." years later. Sociologists and historians trying to understand how Harlem became uniquely independent from the major criminal organizations that controlled the rest of New York would keep returning to the same moment. March of 1934. Not because it was loud or dramatic in the way history often is, but because it marked a quiet but irreversible shift in how power worked. They would study court records, police files, newspaper articles, and oral histories passed down through generations. And again, they would point to that single week, the week when Bumpy Johnson unified Harlem and demonstrated that there was a form of power stronger than guns, stronger than money, stronger than fear. It was the moment when a young man, still rising, still underestimated, looked directly at the most feared gangster in New York and said something no one had ever dared to say before. Not here, not in my neighborhood, not while I'm standing. That sentence mattered more than any bullet ever fired. What followed reshaped Harlem's identity. For the first time, the neighborhood did not see itself merely as territory to be exploited, but as a community capable of defending itself. People who had once felt powerless began to understand that collective action, organized, disciplined, and united, could stop even the most powerful forces in the city. Harlem stopped being just a place where things happened to people. It became a place where people decided what would happen. The criminal underworld noticed immediately. For decades, power in New York had followed a simple formula. Money bought influence. Influence bought protection, and violence enforced the rest. Harlem broke that formula. What Bumpy Johnson demonstrated was that legitimacy inside a community could be more valuable than any army of enforcers. That when a neighborhood stood behind one man, that man became untouchable in ways outsiders could not understand. This was not just a victory over Dutch Schultz, it was a redefinition of power itself. Schultz had believed that fear alone was enough. He believed that once he made an example, Harlem would fold like every other neighborhood had. What he failed to understand was that fear loses its effectiveness when people have something worth defending, and Harlem did. It had its pride, its culture, its sense of belonging, and finally, it had leadership willing to draw a line. When Schultz walked into that police precinct and made the choice that would ultimately destroy him, he believed he was asserting dominance. In reality, he was sealing his fate. By crossing a line he did not recognize, he triggered forces he could not control. His downfall was not caused by a single betrayal or a single arrest, but by a fundamental misunderstanding of how deeply rooted community power could be. The consequences rippled outward. From that point on, the underworld understood something new. There were neighborhoods that could not simply be absorbed. There were places where outsiders paid a price, not just in money or blood, but in reputation and legitimacy. Harlem became a warning, a reminder that some territories did not belong to whoever had the most guns, but to whoever had the loyalty of the people who lived there. For decades afterward, bosses would speak of Harlem differently. They didn't talk about it as easy territory or untapped profit. They talked about it carefully, quietly, with respect. They understood that certain lines, once crossed, could never be uncrossed, and that the cost of crossing them could be catastrophic. What had happened in March 1934 didn't just protect Harlem, it altered the mental map of New York's criminal world. It proved that community, when unified, could resist even the most violent forms of control. It proved that leadership rooted in respect could outlast leadership rooted in fear. And that lesson endured. Long after Bumpy Johnson was gone, long after Dutch Schultz had become a cautionary tale, the principle remained. Harlem belonged to its people. And anyone who forgot that would learn the same lesson. Schultz did that. There are forces more dangerous than any kingpin ever imagined.